The Bible is said to be a book primarily about one man, Abraham, and his descendants. Ultimately, we will all become children of this man through our faith and conversion. But we also know that there are many other players in this story as they come in contact with the Israelites. And today I want to trace one group of non-Israelites through Scripture, their relationship to God, and a truly inspiring prophecy and lessons we can learn from this remarkable family. Our first exposure to them is in the book of Genesis and the life of Abraham. It's fairly incidental, but let's read it anyway. We find the story in Genesis 15 and verse 18. God is making some promises to Abraham, Genesis 15, verse 18. And he says, "On the same day the Eternal made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenites, and the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.'" These were people that were inhabiting the land. And the first one mentioned is a family or a tribe called the Kenites. We don't really hear anything more about the Kenites until the book of Exodus, but even there we don't know that we have encountered them again unless we first read a verse in Judges. In Judges 1 and verse 16, Judges 1 and verse 16, we read this fairly short passage that tells us, "Now the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people." Moses' father-in-law was the priest of Midian when Moses fled Egypt. We meet him in Exodus 2, which I won't read here. Moses kept his flock for 40 years. He had 7 daughters, and Moses married one of them, who gave him 2 sons before God sent him back to Egypt to free the Israelites. And he is here in Judges called a Kenite, even though he acted as a priest for Midian. We read more about him in the book of Exodus in chapter 18. In Exodus chapter 18, in verse 1, Exodus 18:1, we read, "And Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, that the Eternal had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, with her 2 sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, 'I have been a stranger in a foreign land.' And the name of the other was Eleazar, for he said, 'The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh.' And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God." In verse 6, "Now he had said to Moses, 'I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her.' So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Eternal had done to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Eternal had delivered them. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Eternal had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, 'Blessed be the Eternal, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Eternal is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Jethro was impressed, and apparently, from what he heard, he became converted and began to follow the Eternal. At some point, Jethro returned home, as we read in verse 27. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way to his own land, apparently without his daughter and 2 grandsons, and apparently without at least one son, and who knows how many more. Because in Numbers 10, we read another story about Jethro's family. Numbers 10, verse 29, this is about a year later. They're getting ready to leave the mountain. Numbers 10, verse 29, now Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for the place of which the Eternal said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will treat you well, for the Eternal has promised good things to Israel. And he said to him, I will not go, but I will depart to my own land and to my kinsmen. So Moses said, please do not leave, inasmuch as you know how we are to camp in the wilderness, and you can be our eyes. And it shall be, if you go with us, indeed it shall be that whatever good the Eternal will do to us, the same we will do to you. Apparently, Hobab agreed and stayed with the Israelites, and they would need him too, because shortly after this they refused to go into the promised land and were sentenced to spend the next 38 years wandering in the wilderness. So this family that Moses married into, part of the Kenite tribe, becomes even more associated with the Israelites. And so, as we read in Judges 1, the children of Jethro, the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms, and the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad. And they went and dwelt among the people. They accompanied Israel and Judah into the promised land, settling in the southern territory that Judah occupied. But not all of them, for they were a nomadic people. And so we get this story in Judges 4. Judges 4 is the story of Deborah. And in Judges 4, verse 1, we read that when Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Eternal. So the Eternal sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Hagoyim. And the children of Israel cried out to the Eternal, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time, and she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Eternal God of Israel commanded, saying, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor? Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. And Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now he had been told specifically that God would be with him, that he would deliver him from Sisera, but Barak shows a little bit of mistrust in God and wants his prophetess to go with him. And so she said, I will surely go with Sisera. I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Eternal will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose, went with Barak to Kedesh, and Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh. He went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went with him. Now in verse 11 we read, Now Heber the Kenite, of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites, so he had left the area in the south of Judah, pitched his tent near the terebinth tree of Zaanaim, which is beside Kedesh. Then in the next few verses we read of Barak's victory, and in verse 17, however, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. As we look through the scriptures and we see the Kenites tend to be a fairly peaceful people, dwelling in peace with the people around them. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. Then he said to her, Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him. And he said to her, Stand by the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, Is there a man here? You shall say, No. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg, took a hammer in her hand, went softly to him, drove the peg into his temple, and it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died, and then as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, Come, I will show you the man whom you seek. And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera dead with the peg in his temple. And the prophecy of Deborah was fulfilled. Jael was even memorialized in the Song of Deborah in chapter 5. And in verse 24 of Judges 5, Most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed is she among women in tents. Notice the idea that they were dwelling in tents, that comes up later. He asked for water, she gave milk. She brought out cream in a lordly bowl. They said the Kenites tended to be nomadic, dwelling in tents, and they tended also to dwell at peace. That's why Heber was at peace with Jabin. But nevertheless, Jael took the side of Israel in this battle, and there isn't any indication that Heber was furious with his wife for doing so. The Kenites again show up in the days of Saul. In 1 Samuel 15, and verse 2, 1 Samuel 15:2, Thus says the Eternal of hosts, I will punish what Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, Go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. These Kenites were particularly the ones that showed kindness to the Israelites, which were definitely the family of Jethro. But perhaps others of the tribe were included as well. As we know, Saul didn't carry out all of the instructions regarding the Amalekites, and God chose to replace him with David. But David had to flee from Saul before assuming the throne and took up residence with the Philistine king Achish. And so in chapter 27 of 1 Samuel, we read about David's stay with Achish. 1 Samuel 27 and in verse 5, then David said to Achish, if I have now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? Verse 6, so Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 full year and 4 months. And David and his men went up and raided the Jeshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. For those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. Then Achish would say, where have you made a raid today? And David would say, against the southern area of Judah, or against the southern area of the Jerahmeelites, or against the southern area of the Kenites. David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform us on us, saying, thus David did. And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, he has made his people Israel utterly abhor him. Therefore he will be my servant forever. The Kenites were among those that Achish associated with Israel, and therefore would turn the Israelites against him, against David. When the Israelites were going to war against Saul, during which battle Saul would be killed, David went with them, but in spite of Achish defending his presence, the Philistine leaders wouldn't have it. So David was sent back to Ziklag, which he discovered had been burned, and the inhabitants, the families of David and his men, taken captive by the Amalekites. David was able to recover all, and then some, and from the spoils he sent presents to all who had helped him through the years. And in chapter 30 of 1 Samuel, we read some of these people are. It says, when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoils to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. And then we read about several others until we get to verse 29, which says, and those who were in the cities of the Kenites. So David, of course, did not attack the Kenites. That was a ruse. They were friends, and he rewarded them for their help by giving them some of the spoils. We're going to narrow our focus a little now using a verse in 1 Chronicles in a section of Scripture we rarely read in the genealogies of the first 9 chapters. And we'll turn now to 1 Chronicles 2. 1 Chronicles 2. First Chronicles 2, and then in verse 55, we read that, and the families of the scribes who dwelt at Jabez were the Tirathites, the Shimeathites, and the Sukathites. These were the Kenites who came from Hamath, the father of the house of Rechab. Among the Kenites, we find one family here called the house of Rechab. And this leads us to the story of Elijah. We're going to read part of the story in 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 19, after Elijah's triumphant encounter with the prophets of Baal, Jezebel threatened to kill him. Elijah fled to Horeb. God told him to stand on the mountain before him. God demonstrated his power, but did not choose to speak with Elijah through that power as he had with the Israelites at this same mountain on Pentecost hundreds of years earlier. Elijah needed a softer touch, and God spoke to him in a gentle whisper, as it reads in the NLT. And in verse 13 of 1 Kings 19, verse 13, we read, "So it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' So he said, 'I have been very zealous for the eternal God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life.' Then the Eternal said to him, 'Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill. Whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill.' And in verse 18 he says, 'Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him.'" Elijah was a bit prone to hyperbole when he claimed he was the only one left. He was despondent at this point, but he really should have known better. And I'm sure he did. Elijah probably knew who Elisha was. Elisha was certainly faithful to God. Elijah wasn't really alone. Then there were the 100 prophets Obadiah had hidden in 2 caves. And what about the sons of the prophets that Elijah and Elisha visited in Bethel and Jericho? 50 of whom watched as they crossed the Jordan before Elijah was taken away. But 7,000? Apparently Elijah was not aware of all of these non-Baal worshipers, but they existed. They may not have been making their presence known. Indeed, it may not have even been safe to do so. They may have been quietly carrying out God's will in their lives without any fanfare. Elijah was told to anoint Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha, but Elisha was the only one Elijah himself anointed. Perhaps he was so excited about getting to retire that even though it was mentioned last, he skipped right to that one and ignored the others. Anyway, for whatever reason, Elisha actually fulfilled the other 2 commands. Jehu, the second man God instructed Elijah to anoint, was probably another who had not worshipped Baal, because one of Jehu's first acts after brutally establishing himself as king was the destruction of Baal worship in Israel, at least for a while. After killing many of the potential heirs to the throne as he is making his way to the capital of Samaria, we read this in 2 Kings 10. 2 Kings chapter 10. And in verse 15, 2 Kings 10:15, "Now when he departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab." So we were introduced to them a little while earlier, one of the descendants of the Kenites. He met Jonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him, and he greeted him and said to him, "Is your heart right as my heart is toward your heart?" And Jehonadab answered, "It is." Jehu said, "If it is, give me your hand." So he gave him his hand. He took him up to him into the chariot. Then he said, "Come with me and see my zeal for the eternal." So they had him ride in his chariot, and when he came to Samaria, he killed all who remained in Ahab in Samaria, till he had destroyed them according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke to Elijah. Now we don't know how Jehu knew this man, Jehonadab, or his reputation, but Jehu asked Jehonadab to join him, to help him show his zeal for God. And Jehonadab agreed, but he was a Rechabite, a Kenite, not an Israelite. Then in verse 18, "Then Jehu gathered all the people together and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his servants, all his priests. Let no one be missing, for I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu acted deceptively with the intent of destroying the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu said, "Proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal." So they proclaimed it. Then Jehu sent throughout all Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. So they came into the temple of Baal, and the temple of Baal was full from one end to the other. And he said to the one in charge of the wardrobe, "Bring out vestments for all the worshippers of Baal." So he brought out vestments for them. Then Jehu and Jonadab, the son of Rechab, went into the temple of Baal and said to the worshippers of Baal, "Search and see that no servants of the Eternal are here with you, but only the worshippers of Baal." So they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had appointed for himself 80 men on the outside, and had said, "If any of the men whom I have brought into your hands escapes, whoever lets him escape, it shall be his life for the life of the other." Now it happened as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, that Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, "Go in and kill them. Let no one come out." And they killed them with the edge of the sword. Then the guards and the officers threw them out and went into the inner room of the temple of Baal. And they brought the sacred pillars out of the temple of Baal and burned them. Then they broke down the sacred pillar of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal and made it a refuse dump to this day. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. God had said there were 7,000 in Israel who quietly refused to worship Baal. But Jonadab was apparently not an Israelite, being descended from the Kenites, possibly even Moses' father-in-law himself, who was quietly dwelling in the land with his people, not adopting the pagan religions around them and remaining faithful to God. And this man, ruling his household, made a remarkable request of his family in particular, if not the other Rechabites as well. And we read about that request in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 35. Jeremiah 35, beginning in verse 1. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Eternal in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, saying, "Go to the house of the Rechabites, speak to them, and bring them into the house of the Eternal, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink." And then it says Jeremiah brought some of these men in, and in verse 5, he says, "Then I set before the sons of the house of the Rechabites bowls full of wine and cups. And I said to them, 'Drink wine.' But they said, 'We will drink no wine.' For Jonadab, the son of Rechab, the man we'd read about with Jehu, our father, commanded us, saying, 'You shall drink no wine, you nor your sons, forever. You shall not build a house, sow seed, plant a vineyard, nor have any of these. But all your days you shall dwell in tents, and that you may live many days in the land where you are sojourners.'" So as we read with Heber, in the days of Deborah, they're still dwelling in tents, and they are still sojourners in the land. "Thus we have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he charged us, to drink no wine all our days, we, our wives, our sons, or our daughters, nor to build ourselves houses to dwell in, nor do we have vineyard, field, or seed. This was not their land. But we have dwelt in tents, and have obeyed and done according to all that Jonadab our father commanded us. But it came to pass, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up into the land, that we said, 'Come, let us go to Jerusalem for fear of the army of the Chaldeans, and for fear of the army of the Syrians. So we dwell at Jerusalem.'" And in verse 12, "Then came the word of the Eternal to Jeremiah, saying, 'Thus says the Eternal of hosts, the God of Israel, Go and tell the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, Will you not receive instructions to obey my words, says the Eternal? The words of Jonadab the son of Rechab, which he commanded his sons not to drink wine, are performed. For to this day they drink none, and obey their father's commandment. But although I have spoken to you, rising early and speaking, you did not obey me. I have also sent to you all my servants the prophets, rising up early and sending them, saying, Turn now everyone from his evil way, amend your doings, and do not go after other gods to serve them. Then you will dwell in the land which I have given you and your fathers. But you have not inclined your ear to obey me. Surely the sons of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, have performed the commandment of their father, which he commanded them, but this people has not obeyed me. God chose this family and the man Jonadab who helped Jehu for a very important lesson we can all learn from. First, Jonadab set a remarkable example to his family. This included stepping in when invited to fight against the worship of Baal and promote the God of Israel. Jehu ultimately went off track. Jehu went off track, but the scriptures imply that Jonadab did not. He earned the respect of his family, and it's something we need to do for our families. And second, his descendants, respecting and honoring their father when commanded to live with a few restrictions he imposed on them, willingly obeyed. God was so impressed with this adherence to the fifth commandment, the first commandment with a promise, that he used this obedience to instruct his people. For while God pronounces doom on Judah in verse 17, he has quite a different message for the Rechabites and a very specific promise for honoring their father. And we read that in verse 18, where Jeremiah said to the house of the Rechabites, Thus says the Eternal of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have obeyed the commandment of Jonadab your father, and kept all his precepts, and done according to all that he commanded you, therefore thus says the Eternal of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab the son of Rechab shall not lack a man to stand before me forever. This family of non-Israelites was given a promise that they would remain somewhere on this earth forever. And so I want to leave you with one more lesson from this remarkable family. The Kenites in general, and the Rechabites in particular, had a long association with the Israelites, although they seem to have remained somewhat independent of them. Jonadab's command to his descendants to not build houses and plant fields seems to have been made partly to reinforce the idea that they were not part of Israel, and they should continue to live a nomadic life separate from them. They didn't own this land that belonged to the Israelites. Nevertheless, Moses, Deborah, Saul, David, Elijah, Elisha, Jehu, and Jeremiah all interacted with them to some extent. We don't know a lot more about the Kenites and Rechabites, but it would appear from God's promise through Jeremiah that somewhere on earth today they still exist. Have they continued to obey their father? Perhaps God is even still working with them in some fashion. Elijah did not know about all those God was working with, and neither do we. As a group, or even a collection of groups, we can sometimes get to thinking that we are the only ones, as Elijah did. And every once in a while we find out that we are not. This was true when we discovered and developed a friendship with the thousands of Sabbatarians in Angola that God seems to have been working with for decades. Victor Kubik often reminds us of the Sabbatarians he's kept in contact with in and from the Ukraine. Others have been found over the years in Latin America, but they tend to remain independent of us, while continuing to worship God as they have for decades. And that doesn't mean they are wrong in doing so. God works with people differently, and all we can do is worry about ourselves. As with Elijah, God has something for us to do individually, and we need to take care of our own responsibilities, not get too high on ourselves, and recognize that God is in charge and works with others as he sees fit.